All right. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are connecting from. While other people join us, let's get started. First of all, I am Giovanna Sessa, Research Manager of EU DisinfoLab. Welcome to our second webinar of this year. As you might have heard, we are going to have many webinars this year as a way to cater to our community and find ways to have us joined by experts and discuss about the most relevant and timely topics of disinformation. Before we get started, I would also take the occasion to say that this webinar is also our way to contribute to the Democratic Shield Initiative, which is a series of cross-society actions aimed at safeguarding the security and integrity of the 2024 EP elections. So this is how we hope to improve societal resilience from attacks against disinformation. And what better topic than to do this than discussing on gender-based disinformation, which is a threat to our security that we feel particularly strongly about. And to discuss this with us today is Cécile Simmons. Welcome, Cécile. She is a research manager at ISD, specializing in malign influence operations targeting elections, the intersection of gender and disinformation, gender-based online abuse, and conspiracy theories. Her work combines social media network mapping, data analysis, and ethnographic research in closed online spaces. So I cannot think of anyone better than to guide us and navigate us through this topic and to provide insights about her precious research. Before I leave the floor to Cécile, you probably realized it while walking into this webinar. This webinar is being recorded. It will be made available on our YouTube channel afterwards. And at the end of Cécile's presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session via Slido. You can connect using the QR code or the code #disinfo. Enough with the housekeeping rules. Cécile, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and I will leave the floor to you for this exciting presentation.
Thank you, Maria. I'll start by sharing my screen. Fantastic. Hoping everyone can see it. So yes, really excited to be talking about, I suppose, gender disinformation and what we might expect in this election year. And I'll be presenting some of the findings of our various research on the topic, and sort of starting to potentially draw out certain trends going into this year. So the agenda for this short presentation is to talk a little bit about definitions and what we know of the current kind of threat landscape when it comes to gender disinformation. And then I'll be presenting a couple of case studies. One will be from the 2022 midterm elections, and I'll be looking at algorithmic amplification of gender-based abuse and gender disinformation, and how sort of platform features can be used to spread gendered narratives. And I'll also be talking about gendered health disinformation, looking at the example of anti-abortion networks in France and some of the tactics they are using and how this relates as well to some of the tactics we've seen in the more political space. By political space, I mean the electoral space. I'll briefly touch on platform policies related to gender disinformation and where we're at with those. And I'll talk about the threat of generative AI, so deep fakes, and how these can influence the risk of gender disinformation. Just to get us started, I'll share the definition that we at ISD are using when we talk about gender disinformation, and it's not our definition, it's a definition that came from a 2021 Wilson Center report by Nina Jankovic and other researchers, which basically defines gender disinformation as a subset of online gendered abuse that uses false or misleading narratives against women, sometimes with some degree of coordination, not always, with the aim to deter women from participating in the public sphere. So this is, I think, a useful way of thinking about it, but like every definition, it's helpful to a certain extent, but it's got its issues. So when we talk about gendered disinformation and gendered abuse, we need to acknowledge that it impacts people of all gender identities, not just women. And when we speak about gender disinformation as well, that implies a focus on the actor who is producing the disinformation rather than the target of the phenomenon. So I think when, as researchers, we look at this issue, it's important to also acknowledge the impact of some of that content on the target. And finally, another issue I wanted to raise here is the fact that social media platforms themselves don't seem to have settled on a clear definition of what gender disinformation is and what would meet the threshold for kind of community guidelines. So it's a kind of evolving space, but the definition of gender disinformation. So I guess when we speak about gender disinformation, there's a clear link between gender disinformation and gender-based violence, although they're not the same. So gender disinformation alone is not necessarily violent, but it can act as a precursor to gender-based violence because of the nature of the disinformation and the narratives that are being spread. And I'll come back to that later when I look at some case studies. So far, there has been a concerted effort to address gender disinformation when it's explicitly sexualized, because it's more likely to, meet certain thresholds of violence or, violate platforms' terms of service. But the long-term impact of gender disinformation on women in politics, women in public life, and the impact on their careers, their reputation is kind of insidious and kind of long-term as well. And both gender disinformation and online gender-based violence are similar in the sense that they perpetuate misogynistic discourse, and as such, they have a sort of chilling effect on women's participation in the public sphere. So when we think about gender disinformation, it's also important to think about the broader online harms landscape that we're facing. And post-COVID, we have seen an online threat landscape that's increasingly hybrid. So the boundaries between disinformation, conspiracy theories, harassment, extremism have become increasingly blurred. And we see increasingly a broad church of actors who are coming together around crisis points. And they may have different objectives or goals otherwise, but they tend to congregate together against at crisis points. And so in this context, if we apply this to the question of gender, we're increasingly seeing a nexus of gendered disinformation that intersects with misogynistic hate and extremist violence. So I suppose extremist actors have always used, false information and misleading narratives to suit whatever political agendas they're promoting. And at the heart of many extremist actors, there is the desire to impose an extreme patriarchal order and to, restore male supremacy or establish male supremacy. So it's a common thread across many extremist groups across the ideological spectrum, whether we're looking at jihadist groups or far-right extremists. But gender disinformation is not just a manifestation of extremism, although it can be, but it's also an issue in itself. And a growing body of research has shown that gendered abuse and disinformation is now a key political tactic to attack women in the public sphere, particularly during election campaigns. And so both online abuse and gender disinformation have an impact on the health of democratic societies, and they have an impact on diversity and representation in politics. When we talk about sort of gender disinformation and gender-based abuse, of course, this comes from a broad range of actors, including, everyday users on social media. Anyone can spread, I suppose, disinformative and abusive narratives. But we have seen some groups some organized groups at the forefront of gender disinformation and gender-based abuse. And these are essentially extreme misogynistic communities, what we call the manosphere, which to a certain degree intersects with right-wing extremist groups. So the manosphere is the loose collection of anti-feminist movements online that, goes from men's rights activists to red pill communities to incels, who are obviously, have received some kind of media coverage in recent years. And these communities show significant overlaps with extreme right-wing views. So ISD's research, for instance, has shown that once you start consuming red pill content online, for instance, boys and men who consume red pill content on YouTube are then recommended sort of extreme right-wing content quite quickly. And individuals who have been involved in mass violence, terrorist attacks, motivated by misogyny, or were also influenced by extreme right-wing beliefs. And finally, extreme right-wing groups are typically highly misogynistic. We have seen that in, the abuse and harassment of women during Gamergate, but we also see it with, the calls for sexual violence in some extreme right-wing groups. So I'll talk about a study we did last year, basically that looked at misogyny in 2022 as a kind of retrospective. This was a study that was focused on the US, and we wanted to look at 9 events that were significantly either politically or culturally, and look at potential kind of misogynistic conversation around those events. So we selected some political events, some events related to celebrity culture. So we looked at, both the overturning of Roe v. Wade, as well as the Deb v. Heard trial, for instance. And we looked at a range of platforms. So, Facebook, Twitter or X now, Telegram, TikTok, and quite a broad range of platforms. And we, I suppose, found a few things. So elections, unsurprisingly, were a key trigger point for misogynistic content across all platforms, and it cut across partisan lines. So both Democrats and Republicans in the US faced, a wide range of attacks. The content that we found occurred a lot in images and memes, which showed that a lot of this image-based content was used to, evade content moderation and basically work around the platforms. And a lot of it was context-based. So it didn't really use terminology that could easily be picked up by platforms. We identified also a range of kind of intersectional abuse and disinformation campaigns. So both the abusive and disinformative content attacked overwhelmingly women with intersecting identities, so women from religious or ethnic minority backgrounds, or other intersecting identities. Misogynistic influencers played a key role in the spread of misogynistic content online. So obviously everyone's heard of Andrew Tate, and we found that despite being banned from the mainstream social media platforms, his followers continued to share some of his content. So it continued to spread on platforms. And finally, the misogynistic content we identified really intersected with anti-LGBTQ+ hate. So when we looked at the cases of Leah Thomas, of Brittany Griner, we found that both the abusive and disinformative content we identified was basically a combination of, misogyny, but also homophobic and transphobic and racist narratives. When we think of, I suppose, some of that content that we find online, there is a bit of a sliding scale. And whilst in this particular study we looked at misogyny, we realized that, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, that you had the sort of unveiled misogyny, the really abusive, hateful stuff that uses, slurs, misogynistic slurs, and that would meet the threshold of, violation of platform's terms of service. But a lot of the content that we found was just veiled misogyny, so kind of more implied, more implicit, quite often image-based as well. And then we identified gender disinformation narratives. For instance, this, what you see on screen, the kind of, disinformation targeting someone like Michelle Obama, for instance. And that wouldn't necessarily, be something that platforms are addressing. And the gender disinformation narratives in particular, they sort of played on transphobic and racist tropes as well. So again, you can't really see gender disinformation as a phenomenon in itself without linking it to some of the sort of more hateful underpinnings of some of these narratives. So just a few kind of broad themes from our past research. Overwhelmingly, we found that women who are public figures, whether they're politicians or celebrities, face the most fallout and abuse from conspiracy theory and online disinformation compared to men. So for instance, we did a study that looked at QAnon and some of the conspiracy theories promoted by QAnon, and we compared some of the women celebrities that QAnon targeted with its narratives versus male celebrities. And women were received, a lot more abuse from these conspiratorial movements. And women candidates and politicians of color consistently face more abuse than other candidates or politicians during elections, which potentially can deter them from participating in the public sphere. And finally, online misogyny and gender disinformation can come in many forms. So it doesn't just come in the form of the posts themselves. They can be found in the comments section, which is, again, quite tricky. We looked at the 2022 French presidential elections, for instance, and again looked at some Facebook comments, and we found that a lot of the abuse and disinformation in the comments was quite context-based. The moderation was really patchy, and that again can contribute to creating this environment where women and politicians from minority backgrounds are disproportionately attacked. And we also see it in algorithmic recommendations. So I'll briefly present a case study from that, looking at the US midterm elections of 2022. So during those elections, over the course of 48 hours, we looked at platforms' recommendations in relation to 12 women in US politics, either elected politicians or public figures or candidates in office. And we looked at both Republicans and Democrats, women from a range of ethnic, religious backgrounds, trans women as well. And the question we wanted to answer was quite simple, which is, if you're a voter and you're just typing the name of these political candidates in the search bar of social media platforms like TikTok and Instagram, what are you going to find? And so we recorded the top recommended hashtags for each candidate. And then we looked at, among those top 10 hashtags, whether there were any abusive hashtags. And if there were, we looked into the content associated with them. What did we find? We found that for all but one of the candidates, at least one abusive hashtags was recommended among the top 10, and quite often multiple abusive hashtags. And the recommendations, the way platforms recommended those hashtags did not correlate with how many posts they had. So the platforms basically recommended you abusive hashtags at the top, even if they didn't have many posts, as opposed to non-abusive hashtags that had, hundreds of thousands of posts. So there was really a sort of algorithmic, I suppose, amplification of abusive content. And the abusive content that we identified frequently included misogynistic slurs, dehumanizing language, and disinformation narratives as well, sometimes in the form of memes and photoshopped images. So the disinformation campaigns that we identified when it came to women overwhelmingly were, I suppose, sex related. So they focused on rumors, gossip around female candidates having, affairs and so on, cheating on their husbands, which again, I think shows, shows the nature of the conversation. And when it came to candidates with intersecting identities, they really played around fears of the other. So for instance, Ilhan Omar is someone who has been, that in the US has been the target of disinformation, gender disinformation narratives. There have been various disinformation campaigns saying that, for instance, there was one case, the Project Veritas video, where there were allegations that her team had manipulated the ballot, which in the context of someone who comes from an immigrant background aims to portray her as someone who is other, who doesn't belong in the country and doesn't belong in the public space. We saw that with Rachel Levine, again, the othering and the sort of transphobic nature of the abuse. So as I said, Muslim candidates as well were targeted with specific kind of treason-related abuse and disinformation that basically compared them to Islamist terrorists, again, with a very specific agenda. And much of this content violated platforms' terms of service, and a lot of the recommended content that we found was shared by accounts which had previously been labeled for sharing, sensitive content. So they were accounts that were identified as not being trustworthy. And finally, we also identified an example of inauthentic amplification of abusive content that was targeting the Democratic candidate Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on Twitter. And that was essentially the same message being copy-pasted multiple times. And the authors of the campaign were weaponizing the hashtags, and the fact that the hashtags were recommended so high up in the search results of platforms to amplify the campaign further. So I'm now going to briefly talk about something that isn't directly related to elections, but it really shines a light on the way gender disinformation across the board is a political issue. And I'm going to talk about a study we did on anti-abortion networks in France really recently. And as you may know, France is currently debating entrenching abortion rights in the constitution, which is a promise that President Emmanuel Macron has made. So with this study, we wanted to examine a few things. We wanted to look at the nature of online anti-abortion activity in France, looking at the key narratives and tactics of anti-abortion networks and actors online, and in particular determine what part disinformation and misinformation plays, as opposed to just overt anti-abortion views, I suppose. And we were also interested in the way actors shared, amplified, and monetized this content, and how platform functionalities could be used to do that. And so what did we find? So we found that anti-abortion activism actually was mostly health dis and misinformation rather than explicit anti-abortion content based on, say, ideological or religious views. So we found a really wide range of misinformative content, misleading content, highly dissuasive and shocking content targeting a wide range of users. And the aim of this content was to dissuade women from seeking abortion care by introducing doubts about the safety of the procedure. So there were a lot of posts around abortion causing side effects, or cases of women saying that they had had an abortion and they were mistreated by doctors and medical staff. So I suppose undermining trust in the medical establishment. And social media platforms do not protect users against that type of content. So out of the 4 platforms we looked at, which were the 4 biggest platforms, Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube, only YouTube has a clear policy to address abortion-related disinformation. And the most active communities in sharing anti-abortion content were somewhat, enlightening, because of course, as you would expect, you would find the pro-life organizations in there. But there was a much bigger constellation as well of online actors who amplify this sort of content. And you had, of course, Christian groups, but also supporters of the far-right candidate Eric Zemmour, who ran in the presidential elections in 2022. And they are on the map that you can see. These accounts are in yellow, and they were very active in amplifying this sort of content. And among the most active accounts as well, we identified crisis centers and what we called personal testimonial pages. So these were essentially actors that present themselves as neutrals, just sort of support pages for women who are looking for information. And if you didn't really look further, you could think that they were actually, I suppose neutral, but what they were actually is linked to anti-abortion networks. So they were not what it said on the tin. And these were really active. And I think that really shows, I suppose, some of the kind of misleading way that some of these actors present themselves. Across the different platforms we looked at, there were a few tactics that we identified. So as I just hinted to, a lot of anti-abortion pages actually parade as pro-abortion pages, or at least neutral pages. And they were very good at disguising what they were. They used very appealing visuals. They, used pro-choice hashtags. They presented themselves as unfiltered discussion places for women, and they posted massively. So we identified multiple cases where the same message was copy-pasted and shared massively by a range of actors in the network. And they bought a lot of ads on Meta, including ads targeting sort of 18 to 24-year-old women and sort of 13 to 17-year-old women as well. And the range of disinformation tactics they used was quite diverse. So they spread sort of health misinformation, they cherry-picked data, they presented figures about abortion quite selectively, and they posted a lot of videos of women saying they regretted their abortion. So we had one page that was specializing just in that, just flooding the internet with videos of women saying they'd had an abortion, it was awful. And these testimonials, are impossible to debunk, and they might well be true. It is possible for someone to absolutely have an abortion and regret it. But these pages produced a large amount of these testimonials and inauthentically amplified this content online. On X, what we noticed was slightly different. We, perhaps because of the nature of the platform as well, on X, we found that anti-abortion networks weaponize certain specific events in the political and public sphere to communicate anti-abortion views. So in particular, debates about abortion rights in the Constitution, where widely weaponized. We saw them as well tie abortion to broader culture wars issues, so saying that abortion is just one aspect of the destruction of traditional family, that, tying it to other things like sex education in schools and whipping up fears around that, or, linking it to LGBTQ plus rights. And again, we had a number of pages that were essentially misleading users about what they were, pretending that they are pro-choice when they're actually anti-abortion pages. And that is something that actually French law forbids. So you are allowed in France to have anti-abortion views. Anyone is entitled to their views. But what you are not allowed in French law to do is to mislead online users about what you are. So if you pretend to be a neutral page and you spread actually dissuasive and shocking content, that is a violation of French legislation, for instance. And finally, on YouTube, we did a bit of an exercise where we created 3 accounts, 3 fresh accounts of 3 different types of users, including an underage user, and we trained those accounts to manifest an interest in abortion-related content. And then over a period of 2 weeks, we recorded YouTube's algorithms recommendations every 15 minutes, every day for a couple of weeks. And we then recorded all the abortion-related videos that were recommended to all 3 users. And what we found there was that YouTube's algorithm repeatedly recommended highly shocking, misinformative videos about abortion. And although YouTube has a policy that says that basically any video about abortion needs to have an information panel, that policy wasn't consistently applied. So a lot of the content that was recommended, including to a 15-year-old, for instance, didn't have those warnings and those information panels redirecting users to the website of the government, for instance. And we also found that anti-abortion actors massively invested in advertising on social media platforms, particularly on Facebook. And Meta, for instance, generated at least 43,000 euros. I mean, that is actually also likely an underestimation, with nearly 200 anti-abortion ads in France in basically the year that followed Roe v. Wade. So following the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US, we are seeing a concerted effort to spread anti-abortion views, which, as I said, are increasingly couched in health misinformation. And these ads pretty much got nearly 10 million views. And out of those, a number of ads targeted minors, and some included references to dangerous procedures like the abortion pill reversal, which is essentially a procedure that says that you can take progesterone to reverse the effects of medical abortion, which is a procedure that's been described by the American College of Gynecologists as unethical and dangerous to do. I suppose, what are the consequences of that type of content online? So gendered disinformation, and in this case, gendered health disinformation, can really contribute to shifting online discourse around an issue, for instance, like reproductive rights, in a context where reproductive rights are being rolled back or restricted in multiple countries around the world, including in Europe. And anti-abortion actors are increasingly using sort of deceptive tactics that we're also seeing in the political sphere and in the context of elections. So health misinformation, appealing visuals, websites that, I suppose, deceptive and misleading websites, weaponizing pro-choice hashtags, and various amounts of inauthentic or suspicious amplification. So what was particularly interesting is that when you look at, I mentioned the fact that this anti-abortion content was widely amplified by Eric Zemmour's party, which ran in the 2022 elections. And that party, Eric Zemmour's party, Reconquête, has been linked to a number of, astroturfing campaigns and inauthentic tactics during the political campaign. So you can really see here that intersection between gendered disinformation and more politicized agendas. And, combined with algorithmic amplification, combined with, YouTube's algorithms recommending this type of content to users, it basically creates an online environment where women who are looking for reliable information about abortion or reproductive health are not receiving that reliable information. And similarly, voters who are looking for information about political candidates are being served disinformative and abusive content. Just a quick word on platform responses. And I suppose when we think of the current platform policies, what you can see from this little chart that we've got here is that they are not really fit for purpose. So although their hate speech policies do protect, sex, gender identity, and, any overtly hateful speech will fall under those policies, gender disinformation is not really addressed meaningfully by any platform. And there are other, I suppose, related issues to that, which is that misogynistic actors and malign actors more broadly will exploit gaps in platform policies to attack women online. So if the platforms don't have robust policies that address gender disinformation, then we will see actors use these sort of tactics against them. They will also use platform features in unexpected ways, to take advantage of the conversations that are happening online. They will jump on any trending topic to push, violent and misogynistic rhetoric. And as I said earlier, we do have the examples of the kind of unveiled and blatant misogyny, and these are addressed in platform policies, but we see a wide range of other types of narratives, including veiled misogyny and gender disinformation, that can be just as harmful to women and people from minority backgrounds. Without going into detail, into the kind of detail of what we recommend in terms of what we do about the problem, I suppose the answer is kind of twofold. Currently, the national legislation is still lacking in terms of ensuring that gender is protected as a characteristic in laws. So, there is, I suppose, an effort to be made there in terms of legislation, which currently is not, we're not there yet. And in terms of tech platforms, there are a number of things that can be done. As I said, the platforms have some policies, but these are not properly enforced. There is a big gap in addressing gender disinformation, and there are a number of things that could be done. We could, the platforms could examine the tactics of some of these disinformation actors and put some breaks in place to, prevent some of that content from going viral. There's also some work to be done in terms of being kind of more proactive in identifying this sort of content and making sure it doesn't spread across multiple platforms. And finally, of course, as we've always said, researchers do need data access to sort of platform data to analyze this phenomenon in greater detail. And I'll finish with a word on generative AI and I suppose issues of deep fakes, which have been in the spotlight recently with obviously the kind of case of Taylor Swift. and the deep fake pornographic images of the pop singer that circulated online at the same time as we saw some politicized communities also spread disinformation about her, saying that she's, you know, a political pawn. And that was quite an interesting moment, because I think that it really shone a light on the threat of generative AI and deepfakes on women's safety, but also democratic discourse. And I won't go into detail, but I'll just say a few words on that. So non-consensual image sharing, so kind of deep fakes, whether they're sexualized or not, present a threat to women's participation in politics and public life. And we think of deep fakes as, you know, I suppose, a danger for the spread of disinformation online. But what is also important to say is that the current deepfakes are overwhelmingly pornographic deepfakes. About 95% of deepfakes are basically porn, and they feature women overwhelmingly. And so when we think of deepfakes, I suppose what we need to kind of think about is the way deepfakes can be weaponized to promote gendered disinformation narratives about, well, gender disinformation narratives in general, whether that's sexualized or not. And what we might anticipate is that deepfakes, regardless of their nature, might exacerbate the previous trends we have identified. So the other abuse we have seen during elections targeting women overwhelmingly focus on undermining women's competence and intelligence. They also, as I said, overwhelmingly target women from religious and ethnic minority backgrounds to present them as not belonging, and to present them as others. And so we can anticipate that some of that deepfakes could be used to spread similar narratives. But when we think about deepfakes, the key sort of takeaway is that deepfakes are currently overwhelmingly targeting women, and they could be equally weaponized for more politicized agendas. I'll just stop there for now, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Cécile. That was really very, very interesting and comprehensive. I would like to open the Q&A now. Please connect on Slido, and you can use #disinfo to let us know what you would like to ask our speaker. Maybe I can start with a question. So I was wondering, it sure feels like gender-based disinformation on platform is currently being moderated mostly when associated to other sorts of teams and emergencies as election-related, health-related. And we all know that platforms are also not consistently enforcing already policies that they have. I would like to hear your thoughts on whether you envision that at some point it will ever be possible to have a specific platform regulation on gender-based disinformation, and if you think that such a specific policy would be useful. We are been following, for instance, how platforms develop specific policies on climate, health, election-related disinformation. Is gender also something that should be next?
I mean, absolutely. As I said, I think at the moment we are still at a time when there's still a sort of conceptual effort to be made in terms of defining what gendered disinformation is, and we can't seem to fully agree on what is, I suppose, a gendered disinformation campaign. But we have seen with the case of, for instance, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, platforms had policies around health disinformation, or some of them did, but then YouTube, for instance, adopted a more granular policy that looked specifically at abortion-related disinformation. And that was really necessary because following the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we also did a study that looked at some of the disinformation around abortion that circulated. And there was really a flood of disinformation. And platforms actually should have been prepared for this, really. I mean, the overturning of Roe v. Wade was something that didn't happen just overnight, and there were warning signs, and the platforms overwhelmingly didn't adapt their policies. And I think we need to, I think that those policies need to be a lot more granular, and I think we absolutely need policies that look at gender disinformation, because it is an increasingly prominent tactic. So a few years ago, when we were looking at gender-based abuse, disinformation was the key tactic, and this is really something that we have seen in the last elections. So we are seeing it as a growing problem, and the fact that platform policies don't properly address gender disinformation is a big problem. And I think that we have seen those evolutions in other fields, as you mentioned, climate. I think that by some of the studies, some of the research that's being done in the field can also contribute to conceptualizing what gender disinformation is, and platforms should work more closely with research organizations to, start really delving into the definitions and adapting their policies accordingly.
All right, thank you for that. Could you please stop sharing your screen so maybe we can remind the Slido access? However, some of the questions, okay, very fast. I was seeing them on my other screen, and maybe we can move on to some other questions. I will just read the one on top. As gender-based information will increase during elections, what could the EU do to contrast it?
I mean, I think that it's a really complex question, but I think it's an effort on multiple fronts, and I think that the main recommendation that we have is actually in terms of platforms, because platforms have the power to stop the spread of some of that content. And what we have frequently advocated for is mechanisms, and that can also be, something that regulations demand of platforms, but introduce mechanisms that prevent certain content from going viral, or, limiting the reach or the spread of content. And there is a way to do that. There are ways in, the context of elections or trigger points to, introduce basically measures that stop certain content from going viral, or, have teams review content where it goes viral really quickly, and potentially impose breaks on this type of content. But I also think that in the context of elections, platforms know when elections are happening, they can increase their content moderation efforts around trigger points. And there's been just so much research that has shown that elections are, periods of particular threat for disinformation and gender disinformation. And time and time again, we're seeing that during elections, this type of content is spreading widely. There's also an effort to do in terms of platforms recommendations. When we looked at the case study that I presented on the US elections, there is really no excuse for platforms recommending abusive hashtags so high up in the search results. There are, some fairly simple things that can be done to prevent, the widespread amplification of this type of content.
Thank you. And hopefully the Digital Services Act implementation will work and will help also on that front. Do you see gender-based disinformation in use in foreign interference operations?
So we haven't found prominent examples of it. And this isn't to say that it doesn't exist. I think that foreign, state-backed operations are somewhat tricky to identify in the first place, because quite often that attribution is somewhat complex. We haven't seen, in our research at least, a case of, for instance, a disinformation campaign, say, targeting a women politician that had a link to state actors, for instance, which again isn't to say that it's not going to happen, but for the moment we haven't seen it.
Right. I remember reading something back during the German elections that part of the attack against Annalena Baerbock was in fact coming from Russian sources, but
there was some of it, yes, and I think that some of that content was somewhat misogynistic, and there were sort of elements of it. I don't know to what extent it was a clear sort of very kind of gendered disinformation, but there was indeed that particular case. But we haven't seen sort of more recent widespread cases. But again, doesn't mean it's not happening, or might not happen.
Thank you. The next question concerns a very negative actor. Oh, I'm reading the one below. I will start from that. Probably it allows for a short reply. I wouldn't know how to. Why Andrew Tate content, despite being banned, is still being promoted on social media platforms? How can we limit his influence on gender-based violence?
So the thing about someone like Andrew Tate is that he has amassed such a loyal following, and the men who follow him, they're overwhelmingly men, just love him. And this is something we see in the comments under Tate videos. People say, oh, I just love this guy. He's really, I think this is where we also see an element of kind of strong radicalization when it comes to Andrew Tate. He's really sucked a lot of men into his extreme sort of misogyny and mindset. And so his fans just keep spreading his videos and his content way after he's been banned. And it just keeps circulating broadly on social media, because his followers are very dedicated and spread this sort of content. But here again, this is pure enforcement of platforms' terms of service. If Andrew Tate content is banned, then it is really a case of, and it's still circulating. It's a case of platforms not properly enforcing their terms of service. But something like Andrew Tate, well, we know what we can do to prevent the content from circulating, but the solutions to that sort of content actually go well beyond what we can do online. And it's a lot around offline education work, community work, to actually, offset some of the success that his views have had.
Mm-hmm. I think that this also partially replies to one of the questions that I see on the screen, which is, as disinfo actors seem very effective, what techniques can good actors adopt to improve the performance of their fact-based message online?
I think that is, I suppose, a tricky one as well. When we, I suppose, what we have found is that malign actors are very good at using digital technology in general. They're early adopters of technologies at large. And when we think of something like anti-abortion, the anti-abortion networks we looked at, their content is really appealing. You know, it's very slick, and I think that the sort of the techniques that good actors can adopt, they're also the techniques of kind of online, kind of good online communication. I think a lot of what a lot of organizations are also saying is that influencers are a good conduit for, you know, counter speech and for spreading, I suppose, more fact-based and reliable information as well. So there have been, you know, when it comes to online misogyny and sort of gender disinformation, there have also been attempts at, you know, using influencers to spread some of that message. So possible options.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And back on the more research side, you mentioned at some point during your presentation access to data for researchers on gender disinformation. They agree that this is absolutely crucial. Besides demographic information, what does it look like? I guess what type of data would you like having access to?
So I suppose here what we really need is to have a much clearer view of the content that's being moderated on the platforms. So both the content that's been removed and why it's been removed and for what reason. And we currently don't have a comprehensive view of that. We are also increasingly losing, you know, with platforms like X, now we have a lot of research organizations have lost access to the API to carry out research on these platforms, and that severely limits our ability to study what's going on these platforms.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that we can take one final question. Did you notice a difference in the number of attacks on right-wing or left-wing female politicians?
So in our research, we found that I suppose that in the case of the US, for instance, the abuse kind of cut across partisan lines, and Republican women were attacked at sort of similar levels to Democrats. Although the nature of the abuse was also kind of somewhat different based on the identity of some of the women. So in that particular study, for instance, the Democratic candidates were more likely to be from religious or ethnic minority background. The trans candidate that we looked at was a Democrat. There was no one we could look at that had a similar background in the Republican Party. So the nature of the abuse somewhat differed, but I don't think it is a partisan issue particularly, actually. And we have seen also conservative women, for instance, be abused as well.
That is very interesting, and I think it allows us to end in circularity with the idea that it's not as much politically related, but really into being a woman or being targeted for one's gender. Cécile, thank you so much. That was really, really enlightening, and I'm sure that our audience has been very happy to hear and learn from you. In view of this, may I please ask you to rate the webinar again via Slido. I remind you that the webinar will be made available afterwards on our YouTube channel, and I really hope to see you all next week. On the 27th of February, we will have another webinar with Recorded Future's Brian Liston on Doppelganger Doubles Down, New Infrastructure, New Amplification, where we'll delve some more into the Doppelganger operation, which is still ongoing. Thank you so much, Cécile. It has been a great pleasure. Thank you, and I wish you all a good rest of your day. Goodbye.